นะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนะมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening to you all. Today is the 5th of November, which coincides with the birthday of Luang Por Liam, the abbot of Wat Papong, the monastery built by Ajahn Chah, our teacher. And before Ajahn Chah passed away, his last few years of his life, he was quite ill, so he entrusted many of the duties of running the monastery and teaching to Luang Por Liam, about over 30 years ago, that is, maybe 40 years ago now, back in the 80s, 1980s. But anyway, he's 82 years old today, still going strong. Anyone in Melbourne will know he visited us earlier in the year, and he's visited this monastery many times over the years and visits many of the overseas branch monasteries of Ajahn Chah. He sees it as part of his role, his responsibility to help give guidance and encouragement to monasteries around the world. So he's very experienced at traveling around the world and teaching Buddhism. He speaks a little bit of English, which I sometimes remind people he does actually understand more than he lets on, although he usually teaches in Thai. But when I was Anagarika, so a white-robed, 8-precept lay postulant monk, training in my first year in the monastery in Thailand, he came to visit the monastery I was staying in, which is an island monastery very near the Laotian border on the very eastern tip of Thailand. It was an island, a forested island created when they dammed a river and a reservoir was built. A dam was built, a reservoir happened because the dam was built, so the river flooded and became a huge reservoir of water, and then the highest part of that reservoir became an island, and it was covered with forest and full of animals, and a very peaceful, pleasant place to practice meditation. So it was offered to Ajahn Chah around, I think, 1970 was about the time when it was offered. And he really enjoyed going to that monastery. It became a sanctuary. Anyway, when I was a young Anagarika, first arrived in the monastery, I was sent there to help. There's only a few monks living there, and they had no lay visitors because it was an island. Every day the monks would go across to the mainland in a boat and collect food, come back, and there wasn't much food, so sometimes they needed the Anagarika, me, to collect some fruit or mushrooms or open some tins or something just to add to the daily food because there was so little. So we were all very skinny. Anyway, one day Ajahn Chah's niece got married to a man who lived on the edge of the reservoir. And because it was Ajahn Chah's niece, a lot of senior monks came to the house. They invited them for a blessing, a meal. There was a blessing, paritas were chanted, and I went along and sat at the end of the line of all these senior monks headed by Lumpur Liam. And afterwards, I took him across to the island in the boat. I was also the boat driver, the captain of the boat, as it were, even though I knew nothing about boats, but I knew enough to steer the boat across the water. And later on that day, I gave Lumpur Liam some refreshments, and while I made a drink for him, Chinese tea or something, and gave him a cup of tea, he sat down. He said to me in perfect English, "You must practice speaking Thai every day," which threw me because I thought he didn't speak any English, but he did. And he spoke very well, very clearly. And ever since then, I've noticed he does have quite a few words of English. So he can say a few things sometimes in English, and he uses that when he goes around the world. But he's had an immense influence on the Sangha of Ajahn Chah, particularly since Ajahn Chah passed away. He's been a spiritual guide because he himself is a very wise, peaceful monk. And I think most people agree with that. So he's much in demand. He goes to many monasteries to teach. He helps to build many monasteries, train monks. He ordains monks. He teaches everyone from the king of Thailand down to the farmers that live outside the monastery gates and farm the rice fields, everyone. He's a very experienced Dhamma teacher, whether talking about high states of samadhi. He certainly knows what entering deep states of samadhi or jhana are like. He said he once sat for 7 days without moving, without getting up. And as long as I've known him, he's been a very peaceful monk. His whole mood and the atmosphere around him is very peaceful if you ever meet him or live with him. One other teacher in Thailand once said, and this other teacher has also some ability with the meditation and the practice of samadhi, and he has psychic powers, and he said, Lumpur Liam's mind is so soft and peaceful, it's just like cotton wool, white, fluffy cotton wool, so gentle. So he's a person with a white, fluffy cotton wool mind, which doesn't mean to say he has no wisdom or understanding. He has great wisdom, but it's more just the characteristics of his mind are like that. Very soft, gentle, peaceful, pure. And he doesn't rest very much. Every day he teaches and works and organizes monasteries, many monasteries at the same time, it would seem sometimes. When I lived with him, when Ajahn Chah was still alive, I used to live with him and help to look after Ajahn Chah. And I often was working night shifts from 7 in the evening to about 9 in the morning. Had to stay with Ajahn Chah. So 24 hours a day, there would be monks staying with Ajahn Chah. So there'd be several monks on the night shift. And it was very common for Lumpur Liam, having done all his duties for the day, worked, taught, led the monks in meditation and chanting. Sometimes at like 1 a.m. or 2 a.m., he'd just wander by and check up on us. And usually the monks were doing their duty. They'd be attending to Ajahn Chah, maybe turning him in the middle of the night. We turned him so he didn't get bed sores. Sometimes we had to give him medications. Even in the middle of the night, sometimes we had to change his urine bottle, whatever, just as you would in a hospital. We were active through the night, and he'd come, Ajahn Lumpur Liam would come and check up on us, check on Lumpur Cha as well, and check up on us. And occasionally he'd find the novice monk. We also had one novice monk in our team who had to do certain tasks like washing bed sheets, offering medicines that weren't offered, offering drinks maybe to the monks. But if he didn't have much to do, the novice would sometimes go to sleep, which was against the rules. You're supposed to stay awake while you were on shift. Even though it wasn't a paid job, it was done out of faith and love. But the novices were often only about 16, 17 years old, so they're quite young. So they might sneak away for a few hours, lie down somewhere on the edge of the kuti. And if Luang Por Liam came past at 1 a.m. and found the novice sleeping, he'd say a few words to wake up the novice. Maybe something like, "Oh, dogs sleep less than you," or something like that, just to get the novice in the right state of mind that he should be more alert, more awake. So he's always been known for caring first for Ajahn Chah, his teacher, leading the monks in that, and then running the monastery, teaching the monastery, particularly after Ajahn Chah passed away, and then helping all these other monasteries around the world and lay people everywhere, even going into the king's palace to teach the king how to meditate. So he's had a very full and active life. He's now 82. Today is his birthday, so they have a big celebration at his monastery in Thailand. And he's built his own monastery at his home village. This is about an hour or so's drive away from Ajahn Chah's monastery. Even though he's still the abbot at Ajahn Chah's monastery, he also has his own monastery in his home village. So we send our thoughts to him. And part of the Dhamma practice is recollecting the Sangha, the qualities of the Sangha. And he's one monk who embodies those qualities, one who has practiced well. Supatipano Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho. Practiced directly, meaning directly for the cutting off of mental defilements. Ujupatipano Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho. Practice insightfully for the end of suffering. Nyaya Patipano Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho. And practiced appropriately, correctly, cultivating the Noble Eightfold Path, realizing the Four Noble Truths. Samiji Patipano Bhagavato Sāvaka Sangho. You know, we chant those words regularly, but sometimes we forget what they mean or what they're pointing to. They're pointing to qualities of mind that we are aspiring to cultivate ourselves. And partly we get energy and guidance and direction by recollecting teachers such as Luang Por Liam. So it's always a joy to meet such teachers, remember them, talk to them, listen to their teaching. But what he would say is you have to bring those teachings into your own heart and reflect on them. And he would say things like, you have to become familiar with dukkha, suffering. Because if you hope to go beyond suffering and abandon the causes of suffering, you have to get familiar with it, get to know it. As he knows very well, what human beings tend to do is run away from suffering and hide from suffering and try to get rid of suffering rather than know and comprehend suffering. And this is where we often fall down in our practice of the Four Noble Truths. In the first Noble Truth, dukkha, the Buddha said, dukkha, which refers to pain, suffering, unsatisfactoriness of both material and mental phenomena, is something we don't like to look at. You know, we don't like pain, of course we don't. We don't like the suffering of not getting what we want, getting what we don't want, being with what we don't like. We don't like the suffering of being disappointed in life, not getting what we wanted. Nobody likes all of that. So we try to blot it out or hide away from it. And Luang Por Liam, this morning, he said, you know, that's why people don't have wisdom. It's because instead of looking and learning from suffering, they hide away from it and run away from it. But if you understand the Four Noble Truths, you take suffering as something to learn from, to comprehend, and that's where wisdom comes from. What makes a Buddha enlightened? Comprehending dukkha, comprehending suffering. When you comprehend suffering, what it takes you to or leads you to is to understand what is the cause of suffering. And that's what we have to abandon. Suffering itself is to be known, comprehended. The cause of suffering, craving, clinging, tanha, upadana, that's to be abandoned. But really, to abandon craving and clinging, you have first of all to understand what suffering is, because that's what will reveal the craving and clinging to you. But we often don't get to the second noble truth very quickly because we spend all our time trying to get rid of this suffering in the first place, hide it, squash it, get away from it. So we never get on as to the actual craving and clinging part of the Four Noble Truths, description of the way things are that the Buddha encouraged us to look into. We don't get that far. Remember when before I was a monk, when I was, say, a student, had a bad day, a hard day, a long day, people would say, oh, I've had a long day, I'm going to drink myself out of all my problems. Maybe they had a bad exam or a bad assignment or had an argument between two people in a relationship, or money problems was a very common thing. People would say, I'm going to drink myself out of this. Rather than going to look at the feeling of suffering, the experience, and understand where the craving and attachment are, because they hadn't been taught this, I guess, and they hadn't heard the Dhamma. They just wanted to blot it out with drink or drugs. And that's a very common human response to suffering. It's just escape into other altered states of mind, which actually make things worse. You get drunk and then you sober up, you still got your problem. You've got more problems because you've got a headache and you've wasted all the money on the drink. And maybe when you're drunk, you even create more problems, more suffering by having more arguments or doing more unskillful things. But we tend to do this, even when we're maybe on the Buddhist path now, we've heard a bit about the Four Noble Truths and we start practicing meditation, keeping precepts, reflecting on the Dhamma. We still do it. You notice when you're meditating how quickly you move if you have a bit of painful feeling in your body. Or if you're walking meditation, how quickly you want to stop. It's so easy to just try and run away from dukkha, suffering, rather than to look at it and understand what's going on. We tend to just try and get rid of it. Or if we have a memory, an unpleasant memory pops into the mind as we're meditating, often we want to squash it, or we get angry, I hate this, don't want this. Sometimes we hate ourselves, sometimes we hate another person, blame ourselves, or I'm no good at meditating. Or if it's a thought to do with someone else, and blame them, or they're ruining my meditation because 3 days ago they argued with me. So now they're ruining my meditation. Even though it's 3 days ago, nothing to do with what's going on now. But the memory comes up and we have to find someone to blame. Or if we're in a fragile state of mind, anyone makes the tiniest sound and the mind magnifies it into a big suffering. Why are they making that noise? I'm trying to meditate. Even smell. I was once in a monastery where there was one monk who was struggling to keep his robes clean. In the tropics of Thailand, monks' robes often start to smell because of the humidity and the sweat. Even when you wash them, they often still smell. Quite hard to keep them smell free. And so this monk had big problems. He had quite smelly robes. So he'd sit in the meditation and there was a monk next to him getting really angry because he had to be with this smell, close to the smell. The smell can make us angry. Suffering, pain in the body, aches and pains, tiredness, illness makes us want to get away from it. And you go into a fantasy to try and, you don't have any entertainments when you're meditating, if you're in a monastery at least. Maybe at home you do, but if you're in a monastery, you start meditating. So if you're not in a peaceful state of mind, you're angry over something or irritated, then one way out is to start fantasizing about things you like, food or sexual desire or music or sport or whatever it is that can fill your mind and take you away from your troubles. People will do that in their meditation. These are all very typical responses to dukkha. Rather than looking at it and becoming mindful and comprehending it, we run away from it. So we don't get to see, well, what's going on? Why am I unhappy with this dukkha? That's why we need to practice mindfulness. Learn to pay attention. Because when you pay attention, Ajahn Chah used to say, and Lumpur Liam will say, oh, it's where the dukkha is, very close by, you'll realize there's some craving and attachment going on. That's the underlying cause, and it's a repetitive cause, a habitual cause. So if we don't get to know it, we tend to repeat our mistake and create more and more craving and attachment, and from that more and more dukkha. The Buddha's, one of the Buddha's sort of ways of describing that is samsara, the cycle of birth and death, the endless cycle of birth and death. Whether we're talking about the birth and death of states of mind that we cling to, attach to, cling to happiness that passes, and cling to suffering that passes, pleasure and pain, happiness, suffering, cycles of these different mental states we cling to, born and dying from moment to moment, or the actual birth and death of a human being from life to life. We talk about samsara as like a journey through many existences, past lives, this life, next life. It's born from ignorance of the Four Noble Truths, not understanding with any kind of insight what dukkha is, not knowing the cause and making any effort to abandon the cause. And to abandon craving attachment, we have to cultivate mindfulness and then investigate, observe, learn from our experience so that we can start letting go of craving and attachment. If you don't pay attention, you won't know, you won't see it. And because it's often very close to the experience of dukkha, discontent, pain, suffering, we don't want to look at that, so then we don't see where we need to let go. Sometimes we do a false letting go. So we just smooth over the dukkha, hide it away for a while. It's like when they tell you to clean a room and you sweep everything under the carpet or throw the rubbish in a cupboard. So it's out of sight, but it's still there. It's just you've covered it over. Same kind of thing. We do that in our mind. Often we suppress things, push them to the back of our mind, cover them over with other thoughts, other moods, other feelings that sort of take us away from the present moment, take us away from our suffering. It could be getting drunk or looking for different kinds of pleasures so that you don't have to understand or investigate your dukkha. That goes on in the world on every level, doesn't it? Whether you're kind of average person with average means, average wealth, average level of material wealth and property, or you do it with what you've got, or whether you've been seeking great power, fame, fortune, you're successful in that level, on the level of having a lot of power. We tend to associate power, money, wealth, property with the freedom to escape dukkha, not to understand it and comprehend it in the sense the way the Buddha taught, but more just to escape, not having to do things that we don't want to do or face situations we don't want to face. You know, as human beings, we think the more money, power we have, the more we can buy our way out of dukkha. Have a bigger and better house with more push buttons to control everything and to get ourselves away from the dukkha of life. You know, so we can just order what we want at the touch of a button or at the command of a word, get exactly what we want when we want, so we don't have to have the frustration of not getting what we want. And we don't have to put up with things we don't like, people we don't like, food we don't like, all the things we don't like. We see the more power, the more money, the more success we have on the material level, we'll be able to get away from all that. We don't want to be told what to do. We don't want to have to wait in queues and have to be patient with anything. We want to be gratified instantly. Majority of human beings see that as success and happiness now. That's our culture. That's our way of looking at the world. But of course, we're missing the Four Noble Truths there. We're just using whatever way it means we can to temporarily escape dukkha, or not to understand or comprehend it. So of course it keeps re-emerging. Gradually it comes back to bite us again and again and again. Whereas the Buddha's way is to establish mindfulness in the way of the great teachers like Ajahn Chah, Luang Por Liam, and any other teacher, is to use the Four Noble Truths as a structure for actually understanding your experience, knowing it. And this is from your own experience, not just, you know, theorizing or remembering from the books, but to know dukkha as dukkha. And then to recognize craving and attachment are the cause of dukkha, fed by ignorance, you know, lack of mindfulness, lack of understanding of the Four Noble Truths. With ignorance, craving and attachment keeps arising, and that keeps bringing up this feeling and experience of dukkha. Now, the Buddha helped us. He summarized it quite succinctly. He said, you know, where is dukkha based? Where is clinging and attachment arising? Well, we attach to this body and mind. He described it as 5 khandhas: body, feelings, perceptions, thought formations, and sense consciousness. The 5 khandhas. Through ignorance, misunderstanding the Four Noble Truths, this mind, each person's mind, will cling to the 5 khandhas as self, as mine. We take ownership of body, mind, thoughts, feelings, memories as me, mine, myself. And then we suffer. Whereas the noble ones who have realized the Four Noble Truths and practiced, they don't suffer very much, or maybe not at all, because they don't cling to the khandhas as self. And they've changed that way of viewing the world. They still have their 5 khandhas. They still have a body. As long as they're alive, they have a body. They have intentional thought. They can think. They can remember. They can do things. They feel pleasure and pain. If they're arahant, you know, noble one who's reached nibbana, they don't make any more karma, but they can still think. They still have the faculty of mental formation. It's just they still have that khandha, but they just don't cling to the thoughts with sense of self. If it's Sotapanna, Sakadagami, well, they have still making some karma for the ending of karma. But they understand the difference between good thought, wholesome thought, and unwholesome thought. And they're always letting go of the unwholesome thoughts that arise, the unwholesome intentions, and they cultivate the path for the ending of karma. But what makes a noble one is they see through this delusion that these khandhas are a self and worth clinging to. They've seen them as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and dukkha, and not self, not belonging to a self. So they don't try clinging anymore. They know that's a waste of time, waste of energy, going in the wrong direction. It's going in the way of more suffering, more samsara, more birth and death. They know that. A monk, why does a monk like Ajahn Chah or Lumpur Liam, why can they give so much to the world in terms of their time and energy, their wisdom, compassion, teaching, helping? Because they've seen the Four Noble Truths and they've practiced non-attachment to their five khandhas. So that releases the mind. A lot of good energy and a lot of skillful thinking and knowledge and wisdom that they can then use to help other people. Very good at that. So Ajahn Chah, the teacher, his teacher was Lumpur Man, and Ajahn Chah, and then Lumpur Liam. Ajahn Chah devoted all his time to his own practice and then devoted what was left after that, once he realized these Four Noble Truths, devoted his time and energy to teaching others. Lumpur Liam has done the same, following in the footsteps of his teacher. And many, many other monks, nuns, laymen, laywomen, they practice this to one level or another. But they're willing to learn from dukkha rather than run away from it, blot it out. They take dukkha as teacher, so we call dukkha Ajahn dukkha. My best teacher is dukkha. If you get that understanding established, then dukkha is not so frightening or undesirable in the sense it can give you some wisdom and understanding. You can use it to your advantage. So that it's not something you have to push away, get rid of. It's something you have to learn from. Even the pain of the body, even intense pain, you can learn from it by learning how your mind suffers when it clings to the pain as self, but how the mind doesn't suffer when it lets go of that clinging. Or if someone insults you or disagrees with you, tries to argue with you, how you suffer when you cling to their words and the meaning your mind gives them, but how you don't suffer when you let go of your reaction of aversion and your attachment to your own self-view. When you let go, you don't suffer. When you have memories arise, your unpleasant memories of the past, things that have gone wrong, disappointments. When unpleasant memories arise, excuse me, when unpleasant memories arise, if you can see them that they are impermanent, not self, then the mind doesn't cling and create suffering out of them, doesn't create a self out of them. I am a bad person or an unlucky person, and all the kind of negativity and proliferation that might come from viewing yourself like that. If you can see them as just memories, albeit remembering unpleasant things, then you can let go. Once you're mindful and you reflect like this, this is the fourth noble truth, isn't it? That brings you to the realization of the third noble truth, cessation of suffering. Fourth noble truth is establishing mindfulness and reflecting. These five khandhas are not self. They are what they are. Body is just body, feelings, feelings, memories are just memories, thoughts are just thoughts. When you train yourself to see that without bias, without ignorance, then there's a letting go. There's an acceptance of the truth, a letting go, and even unpleasant memories about things that happened to you, things that went wrong, you can cope with and let go. You don't create suffering out of them. Any meditation technique is helping you to do that, whether it's mindfulness of breathing, cultivating metta, the quality of loving kindness, reflecting on the Buddha, whatever the meditation, it's helping you to establish mindfulness so that you can look at these five khandhas and see them in an objective, detached way, and see them as conditions that do not belong to a self. It's not that there's nothing there, they're there, but it's the grasping that comes from delusion, craving, delusion, create craving, clinging. That's what you let go of. So even, say, an unpleasant memory, a painful feeling associated with injury or illness is known but let go of. You're not creating more self, more suffering out of it. You notice when feeling of suffering is strong, whether it's just mental suffering or physical suffering, and mindfulness and wisdom are not present or not very present, the sense of self comes up really strong with that dukkha, with the painful feeling or the unpleasant state of mind. We attach to it strongly, and the sense of self is strong. So then we don't see beyond it. When the sense of self is strong, the attachment is strong, there's a kind of lack of clarity in the mind. There's a darkness. The mental agitation, mental discontent is strong, overwhelming sometimes. And the good qualities of the path, mindfulness, investigation of the Dhamma, sila perhaps, disappear. They're hard to maintain because of dukkha. That's also why we need to practice a lot of patience. And Luang Por Liam is a good one for displaying great patience in the face of all kinds of difficult situations, whether it's his own health or tiredness of teaching and running monasteries, dealing with other people, all the things he has to face. He's being very patient, as well as mindful, as well as reflective and insightful, with the aim of not letting dukkha overrun his mind, take over his mind. If your mind is kind of white, soft, like cotton wool, that doesn't mean dukkha, does it? That doesn't imply dukkha. It implies a kind of soft happiness, gentleness. Dukkha is hard, unhappy, dark. So that's the opposite of Luang Por Liam's mind, or anyone who's practiced well, understood the Four Noble Truths. Dukkha, when we attach to dukkha and we're not reflecting on the Four Noble Truths, the mind becomes hard. The thoughts are more and more negative, more and more uncontrollable, more unhappy. So it only makes sense to practice more mindfulness and reflect on these Four Noble Truths more and more, because you're going in the way of freedom from suffering. This is why the Buddhist teachings are so valuable to us. They give us a way out of suffering. I remember around the time Ajahn Chah's funeral, when there's incredible pressure on Lumpur Liam because he had to work all the time to organize that funeral. He got a lot of help from the rest of the Sangha, but he personally was leading, building projects, teaching, organizing, arranging all kinds of things with people from all over the country, because it was such a huge event attended by so many people. The logistics of it, the administration of it was incredible. As I said, he had many helpers as well, but him personally, he had a lot of pressure, a lot of things to do over many, many months, from the day Lumpur Cha died to the day that he was cremated 1 year later, January the 16th. Lumpur Liam, when you're living with him and watching him, he really didn't get very much rest at all, but at the same time, he didn't seem to get angry or display suffering. He put up with many, many things. So I once asked him, I said, Lumpur, you're not getting much sleep, are you? He said, no. I said, how are you coping? How do you cope with this? Day after day after day, month after month after month. He said, as long as they give me 1 hour to myself every 24 hours, I can survive. When he said they, he just means life. It's not like there was some group of people conspiring to make him tired and give him all this work, but it was just the position he was in. He had to do many things. But if he had 1 hour to himself, he could get by, he said. That's all he asked for. And he seemed to live it, because, as I said, many times I saw him at 1 a.m., 2 a.m., 3 a.m., 4 a.m., whatever time you think of, he could be active, working, walking meditation, checking things out, doing all kinds of things, resting very little, giving, just giving. When the mind is peaceful, understands the Four Noble Truths, then you're in a position to give. So he would give, sacrifice, give for others all the time, literally day after day after day. Very inspiring to see. And year in, year out, up to this present day. He's 82 years old, still running monasteries, doing all kinds of useful projects, teaching, guiding the Sangha, teaching the laity. So a very good example of a Sangha. And when you reflect on people like that, then this is what we call Sanghanusati, reflecting on the qualities of the Sangha, qualities we can also aspire to in our own practice. So maybe I'll leave you with these reflections tonight, and after this there'll be a time to see if there's any questions to be answered.
Handamayang Dhammakataya Sadhu Karang Dadamase Sadhu 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 Anumodami